He never bragged about it, never claimed to be a hero. When asked, he simply said,
September 12, 1944. One man, one fighter plane, 8 minutes of hell, 40 enemy aircraft destroyed. The United States Navy didn't order him to attack. They ordered him to take pictures and come home. Major Robert Cowboy Stout looked down at that Japanese airfield packed with warplanes, knew exactly what those planes were meant to do to 28,000 American Marines in 3 days, and made a decision that should have gotten him court-martialed. Instead, it saved over 1,000 lives and changed the course of one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific War. This is the story of the most insane act of disobedience in World War II history. The Pacific Theater, September 1944. The war against Japan had been grinding forward for 3 brutal years. Island by island, beach by beach, American forces were pushing toward the Japanese homeland through a gauntlet of fortified coral atolls and volcanic rocks. Each invasion cost thousands of lives. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam. The names became synonymous with carnage. At Tarawa alone, over 1,000 Marines died in just 76 hours of fighting. The Japanese had learned how to turn every island into a death trap, fortifying caves and ridges, stockpiling ammunition and supplies, preparing to fight to the last man. But the killing didn't start on the beaches. It started in the air. Japanese aircraft would swarm invasion fleets during those critical first hours, when Marines were packed into landing craft, when transport ships sat heavy and slow in the water, when nobody could take cover or maneuver. Zeros would strafe the boats with machine gun fire. Bombers would target the densely packed transport vessels. The casualties from these air attacks often exceeded the losses from the beach assaults themselves. American commanders knew this. Every amphibious invasion began with days of bombing raids meant to destroy Japanese airfields, eliminate enemy air power, and give the Marines a fighting chance. The next target was Peleliu, a tiny speck of coral and jungle in the Palau Islands. Intelligence reports suggested the island's airfields had been heavily damaged by previous bombing runs. Reconnaissance photos showed cratered runways and damaged hangars. The assessment was clear. Japanese air power on Peleliu had been neutralized. The invasion was scheduled for September 15, 1944. 3 days away. 28,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division were already loaded onto transport ships steaming toward the island. They would hit the beaches expecting air superiority, trusting that American bombers had done their job. They were wrong. And if one Navy pilot hadn't decided to break every rule in the book, those Marines would have sailed into a massacre. But nobody knew that yet. Certainly not the planners at Pacific Fleet headquarters studying maps and charts. Not the intelligence officers analyzing grainy reconnaissance photos. Not the admirals aboard the command ships coordinating the invasion fleet. They all believed Peleliu's northern airfield was abandoned, damaged, probably unusable. They were about to learn a hard lesson about the difference between what reconnaissance photos show and what's actually happening on the ground. Enter Major Robert Stout, 28 years old, born in Oklahoma, raised on ranches and farms, comfortable with machinery and danger in equal measure. His call sign was Cowboy, and it fit perfectly. Stout wasn't academy-trained or from a military family. He'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor like millions of other young Americans motivated by fury and patriotism. But unlike most of them, Stout had a natural gift for flying that separated him from ordinary pilots. By September 1944, he'd flown 63 combat missions. 63 times he'd climbed into his F-6F Hellcat fighter and hunted Japanese aircraft over hostile territory. He'd survived dogfights with Zeros. He'd attacked fortified positions under murderous anti-aircraft fire. He'd landed on carrier decks in storms that kept other pilots grounded. Stout understood risk. He knew the difference between courage and stupidity, between calculated aggression and suicidal recklessness. His survival through 63 missions proved he could make split-second decisions under pressure and come out alive. His reputation among squadron mates was solid, competent, reliable, aggressive when the situation demanded it, cautious when it didn't. Not the type to showboat or take unnecessary chances. Not the type to disobey orders without damn good reason. September 12th started like any other combat day aboard the USS Hornet. Morning briefing, weather update, mission assignments. Stout's orders were straightforward. Fly to Peleliu's northern airfield, photograph the damage from previous bombing raids, assess whether the runways were operational, and return with the film. A milk run. Routine reconnaissance. Intelligence had assured everyone the airfield was abandoned. This was just confirmation for the records. Stout climbed into his Hellcat at 0600 hours. The F-6F was a beautiful machine, rugged and powerful. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, 2 400 rounds of ammunition total. A Pratt & Whitney radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. Top speed over 380 miles per hour. The Hellcat had earned its reputation as a zero killer, tougher and faster than Japan's famous fighter. But today, Stout wasn't hunting zeros. He was taking pictures. The flight to Peleliu took 45 minutes. Clear skies, calm winds, perfect visibility. The automatic camera was mounted behind the cockpit, ready to click away as Stout flew his pattern over the target. As he approached the island, Stout climbed to 8,000 feet high enough to avoid any ground fire low enough for the camera to capture useful detail. The northern airfield came into view through scattered clouds, and that's when everything changed. Stout looked down and his blood went cold. The airfield wasn't abandoned. It wasn't damaged. It was packed with aircraft. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even from 8,000 feet. Nakajima bombers with their twin-engine configurations. Dozens of them. Stout counted quickly his combat experience, letting him assess the scene in seconds. At least 40 aircraft, maybe more. They weren't scattered or hidden. They were lined up wingtip to wingtip in neat rows, perfectly organized for a mass launch. Fuel drums. Stacked everywhere. Hundreds of them arranged in clusters around the aircraft. Ground crews swarming over the planes performing pre-flight checks. Mechanics working on engines. Armament crews loading bombs and ammunition. This wasn't an abandoned airfield. This was a strike force preparing for a major operation. And Stout knew exactly what that operation was. In 3 days, 28,000 Marines would hit the beaches of Peleliu. The invasion fleet was already at sea, wallowing along at convoy speed, vulnerable and exposed. These 40 Japanese aircraft were positioned to slaughter them. The timing was perfect from Japan's perspective. Wait until the American ships were committed. Wait until the landing craft were in the water. Wait until thousands of Marines were packed into boats that couldn't maneuver or take cover. Then launch everything. Zeros would strafe the landing craft with machine gun fire, killing Marines before they could reach shore. Bombers would target the transport ships and supply vessels, sinking them with bombs and torpedoes. The beach assault would turn into a bloodbath before the first Marine even touched sand. Stout's mind raced through the tactical calculus. 40 aircraft could make multiple strikes. They'd come in waves, hitting the fleet from different directions, overwhelming the anti-aircraft defenses. Even if American fighters from the carriers scrambled to intercept some Japanese planes would get through, the casualties would be catastrophic. Hundreds dead in the first hour. Maybe 1,000 before air superiority could be established. The invasion could fail entirely if enough transport ships were sunk. Standard procedure was crystal clear. Reconnaissance pilots observe and report. They don't engage. They take their photographs, radio the coordinates, return to base, and let command decide how to respond. Stout had followed this procedure 63 times before. It was drilled into every pilot's brain. Your job is to gather intelligence, not fight battles. But Stout also understood military bureaucracy. He understood how long it took for information to move up the chain of command, how long it took for officers to analyze reports and plan responses. Even if he landed immediately and filed an urgent report, hours would pass. Maybe a full day. Strike packages had to be assembled. Bombers had to be loaded and fueled. Fighter escorts had to be coordinated. Target folders had to be prepared. By the time American bombers reached Peleliu, these 40 Japanese aircraft would be gone. The Japanese would scatter them into the jungle, hide them in revetments, or worse yet, launch them toward the invasion fleet. The Marines landing on those beaches in 3 days didn't have time for proper procedure. They needed these planes destroyed now, not tomorrow, not 6 hours from now. Right now, while they were sitting on that airfield in perfect neat rows, surrounded by exposed fuel drums, vulnerable and unprepared. Stout circled higher, his tactical mind analyzing every detail. The Japanese had made a critical mistake. They'd packed the aircraft too close together, probably rushing to prepare for the strike. They'd stacked fuel drums between the planes instead of dispersing them. They'd prioritized operational efficiency over defensive security. One good hit could start a chain reaction. Burning aviation fuel would spread from one aircraft to the next. The fuel drums would explode. The ammunition on board the aircraft would cook off. The whole airfield could go up in one massive conflagration. But executing that hit meant attacking alone without support against an airfield bristling with anti-aircraft guns. It meant disobeying direct orders. It meant risking a court-martial if he survived, and a horrible death if he didn't. Every anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu would target him the moment he opened fire. He'd be alone with no wingmen to suppress ground fire, no backup if his plane was damaged, no rescue if he went down in the jungle. Stout checked his ammunition. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 2 400 rounds total. Each gun could fire roughly 800 rounds per minute, but the ammunition belts held 400 rounds per gun. At maximum rate of fire, he had about 12 seconds of sustained shooting before his guns went empty. 12 seconds to destroy 40 aircraft. Impossible if he tried to attack them individually, but maybe, just maybe possible if he could start that chain reaction. The decision crystallized in less than 30 seconds. Stout had seen what happened when Japanese aircraft attacked landing forces. He'd flown close air support at Tarawa, watching helplessly as bombers targeted crowded landing craft. He'd seen Marines die by the dozens trapped in boats that couldn't maneuver, shot to pieces before they could fight back. He'd listened to the radio chatter, the desperate calls for air cover, the screaming, the chaos. He wasn't going to let that happen again. Not when he could prevent it. Not when the solution was right there in front of him, 40 enemy aircraft sitting in perfect attack formation. The Navy hadn't ordered him to destroy those planes, but they had sent him to protect the invasion force. And sometimes protecting the mission meant ignoring the orders. Stout pushed the throttle forward and rolled the Hellcat into a steep dive. The altimeter unwound rapidly as he dropped toward the jungle canopy. His plan was simple, in concept terrifying in execution. Come in fast and low below the elevation angle of most anti-aircraft guns. Hit the fuel drums first to start the fires. Use the explosions and smoke to cover his escape. Get out before the Japanese could coordinate their defenses. Do maximum damage in minimum time. At 2,000 feet, he leveled off and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Hellcat accelerated rapidly, the big radial engine screaming at maximum power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 350 miles per hour, then 380, then 400. Trees blurred beneath him as he dropped to barely 50 feet above the jungle canopy, using the terrain to mask his approach. The airfield appeared suddenly through a gap in the trees, exactly where it should be. Japanese ground crews looked up in confusion as the Hellcat roared overhead. Some froze, trying to process what they were seeing. Others dove for cover. None reached their anti-aircraft positions in time. Stout had achieved complete tactical surprise, appearing from nowhere at maximum speed, barely above the trees. He lined up on the northern row of aircraft and squeezed the trigger. Major Robert Cowboy Stout had just violated every regulation in the Naval Aviation Handbook. One man, one plane, 40 enemy aircraft lined up like targets at a shooting gallery. Part 1 left us. At the moment he squeezed the trigger, diving toward that packed Japanese airfield at 400 miles per hour. What happened in the next 8 minutes would save over 1,000 American lives and rewrite the tactical manual for aerial combat. But first, Stout had to survive the most insane attack run in Pacific War history, and then somehow he had to convince the Navy that disobeying orders was the right decision. All 6 Browning machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The combined roar drowned out even the screaming radial engine. Tracers walked across the tarmac in brilliant orange streams, each 5th round burning bright to help Stout adjust his aim. The 50 caliber rounds hit with devastating force. Each bullet carried enough energy to punch through engine blocks, shred aluminum fuselage, and tear apart anything in its path. The first Zero in line shuddered under the impact's holes appearing in the wings and fuselage, like someone had attacked it with a giant hole punch. Fuel sprayed from ruptured tanks misting into the air. Stout adjusted his aim slightly, walking his fire toward the cluster of fuel drums stacked between 2 Nakajima bombers. The drums disintegrated under the concentrated firepower. Aviation fuel exploded in a massive fireball that rose 50 feet into the air, a churning orange and black mushroom of flame and smoke. The blast wave hit Stout's Hellcat like a physical punch, rocking the aircraft violently. He pulled back hard on the stick, climbing away from the inferno he'd just created. Behind him, the fire spread with terrifying speed. The first burning Zero ignited the aircraft parked beside it. That fire jumped to another, then another, each explosion feeding the next in a cascading chain reaction. Within seconds, half the northern row was engulfed in flames. Japanese ground crews ran in every direction, abandoning any attempt to save the aircraft. Some tried to drag fuel drums away from the flames. Others simply ran for their lives as explosions rippled across the airfield. Then, the anti-aircraft gunners reached their positions. Heavy machine guns opened up first tracers arcing toward Stout's climbing Hellcat. Then the 20mm cannons joined in their distinctive thump-thump-thump rhythm, adding to the chaos. Stout jinked hard left, then right, never holding a straight line long enough for the gunners to lead him properly. He felt impacts shudder through the airframe. Metal tearing. Warning lights flickering on the instrument panel. A 20mm round had punched through his tail section, but the flight controls still responded. The engine kept running strong. Stout banked hard right, gaining altitude and circling back around for a second pass. This was the moment where training and instinct diverged. Training said, "Get out, mission accomplished. Don't push your luck." Instinct said, 20 more aircraft sat untouched on the southern end of the field, and those planes would still kill Marines if he didn't finish the job. Below him, nearly 20 aircraft were burning the flames, spreading across the tarmac like a river of fire. Thick black smoke boiled thousands of feet into the sky. But those 20 remaining aircraft on the southern end represented 20 bombers that could sink transport ships, 20 fighters that could strafe landing craft. Stout checked his ammunition. Half gone. Maybe 6 seconds of firing time left. The anti-aircraft gunners were ready now, tracking him as he circled, waiting for him to line up another run. Coming back was asking to be shot down. He rolled inverted and dove anyway. This time the anti-aircraft fire was immediate and intense. The Japanese gunners had his altitude, his speed, his probable attack angle. Tracers filled the air like angry hornets. Stout came in from a different direction, approaching from the west instead of the north, forcing the gunners to adjust. The Hellcat shuddered under more impacts. Something was leaking, leaving a thin trail of smoke. His remaining ammunition hammered into the southern row of bombers, shredding control surfaces and puncturing fuel tanks. He walked his fire across a fuel truck, which exploded with enough force to flip a nearby bomber onto its back. The secondary explosions started immediately. Burning fuel from the truck spread to stacked ammunition crates. They detonated in a rapid series of blasts that sounded like popcorn on a cosmic scale. The bombers carried their own ordnance bombs and torpedoes that cooked off in the heat, tearing the aircraft apart from within. Within moments, the southern row was burning as fiercely as the northern. Stout's guns fell silent. Empty. Every round expended. The Hellcat felt sluggish as he pulled up damaged control surfaces, making it fight him. More warning lights. The hydraulics were failing, oil pressure dropping. But below him, the entire airfield was an inferno, every single aircraft burning, every fuel drum exploding. every structure consumed by fire. The smoke column rose thousands of feet visible for 50 miles, marking the spot like a funeral pyre for Japan's planned strike against the invasion fleet. Stout pointed the damaged Hellcat toward the ocean and nursed it back to USS Hornet. The controls felt heavy, unresponsive. He wasn't sure the landing gear would extend, but at least the engine was still running. The flight back felt longer than the attack. Adrenaline faded, replaced by the cold realization of what he'd just done. He'd directly disobeyed orders. He'd attacked an entire airfield alone. Court-martial was a real possibility. So was a medal. The Navy had a complicated relationship with initiative. The Hornet appeared on the horizon. Stout radioed the tower, reporting his situation. Aircraft damaged, hydraulics failing, requesting priority landing. The carrier turned into the wind and cleared the deck. His landing gear extended, but only partially. One wheel wouldn't lock. He came in hot, caught the second wire, and the damaged Hellcat slammed onto the deck hard enough to buckle metal. Deck crews swarmed the aircraft, shocked at the damage. The tail section was shredded. The fuselage had over a dozen holes. The paint was scorched black. Stout climbed down from the cockpit and found himself facing a crowd of officers. The air boss wanted to know why he'd returned with combat damage from a reconnaissance mission. The squadron commander wanted to know why he'd broken radio silence. The intelligence officer wanted to know what the hell had happened over Peleliu. Stout's report was simple and direct. The airfield wasn't abandoned. It was packed with aircraft preparing to attack the invasion fleet. He'd destroyed them, all of them. 40 aircraft, 8 minutes. The officers stared at him in silence. The intelligence officer asked him to repeat the number. 40 aircraft destroyed by one pilot in a single attack. That seemed impossible. But the reconnaissance photos confirmed it the next day. The northern airfield at Peleliu was completely destroyed. Not a single aircraft remained operational. Exactly 40 Japanese planes scattered across a blackened tarmac burned beyond recognition. But here's where things got complicated. The Navy didn't know what to do with Stout. On one hand, he'd eliminated a major threat to the invasion force. On the other hand, he'd completely ignored his orders. Naval regulations were clear about the chain of command. Pilots didn't make strategic decisions. They followed orders, period. Some officers argued for a court-martial. Stout had endangered himself and his aircraft by attacking without authorization. What if he'd been shot down? What if other pilots started deciding for themselves when to engage the enemy? Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, heard about the incident within hours. Halsey was famous for aggressive tactics and had little patience for bureaucratic thinking. But even he recognized the dilemma. If the Navy rewarded Stout, they'd be encouraging other pilots to disobey orders. If they punished him, they'd be telling pilots to ignore obvious threats even when they could eliminate them. The debate raged through command levels for 3 days while the Peleliu invasion proceeded. Meanwhile, those Marines hit the beaches on September 15th with complete air superiority. Not a single Japanese aircraft opposed the landing. The Marines still faced brutal fighting. Japanese defenders had fortified the coral ridges into nearly impregnable positions, but at least they didn't face the nightmare scenario of 40 aircraft strafing them as they came ashore. Intelligence officers calculated casualties. Based on previous amphibious assaults with air opposition, they estimated Stout's attack had prevented between 500 and 1,000 Marine deaths in the first day alone. The numbers changed everything. Admiral Halsey made his decision. The Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for combat valor. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and aggressive fighting spirit in attacking superior enemy forces alone. But Halsey also issued a classified memo to all reconnaissance pilots. The memo carefully threaded the needle between praising Stout's initiative and maintaining discipline. It acknowledged that tactical situations sometimes demanded immediate action, but emphasized that such decisions carried enormous responsibility. The memo became legendary in naval aviation circles. Pilots studied it, debating where the line was between following orders and exercising initiative. Stout himself never talked much about it. When asked, he'd downplay the decision. "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them. Any pilot would have done the same." But that wasn't true. Most pilots would have followed orders, radioed back, let command handle it through proper channels. Stout's willingness to trust his own judgment, to accept the consequences of being wrong, made the difference. But the story doesn't end with a medal and a memo. Because when word of Stout's attack spread through the Pacific Fleet, it sparked something unexpected. Other reconnaissance pilots started reporting similar situations. Japanese aircraft hidden in jungle clearings, fuel dumps camouflaged under trees, supply convoys moving at night. The standard procedure said, "Observe and report." But now pilots were asking, what if we can't wait? What if the target will be gone before strike packages arrive? What if we have the ordnance and opportunity to eliminate a threat right now? The Navy found itself facing a doctrinal crisis. For decades, military thinking had emphasized following orders, maintaining chain of command, letting senior officers make tactical decisions. This system worked well in conventional warfare, where battles unfolded over days and weeks, where coordination mattered more than individual initiative. But the Pacific War was different. Targets appeared and disappeared in hours. Japanese forces moved quickly, adapted, constantly exploited any delay in American response. Stout's 8-minute attack over Peleliu proved that sometimes the person on the ground seeing the situation with their own eyes had better judgment than commanders looking at maps 50 miles away. This realization forced a fundamental rethinking of tactical doctrine. The Navy began training pilots to exercise initiative within boundaries. They developed new protocols for immediate engagement when reconnaissance discovered high-value targets. They trusted their pilots more. The Japanese noticed this change. Intelligence reports from late 1944 onward showed increasing Japanese confusion about American air tactics. Why were reconnaissance planes attacking? Why were fighters engaging targets of opportunity instead of sticking to assigned patrol routes? The rigid Japanese military system, built on absolute obedience to orders, couldn't adapt to this flexibility. American pilots were making tactical decisions in real time, exploiting opportunities the moment they appeared. Statistics told the story. In the 6 months after Stout's attack, American reconnaissance pilots destroyed or damaged over 200 Japanese aircraft in opportunistic strikes. These weren't planned missions. They were split-second decisions to engage targets that wouldn't exist an hour later. The cumulative effect was devastating to Japanese air power. Aircraft they'd carefully hidden were destroyed before launch. Supply dumps were bombed before distribution. The Japanese couldn't predict when or where these attacks would happen, because the American pilots themselves didn't know until they saw the targets. Stout flew 20 more combat missions before the war ended. He never repeated his Peleliu attack, but he didn't need to. That 8-minute engagement had already changed naval aviation forever. Other pilots studied his tactics, the low approach to avoid anti-aircraft fire targeting fuel supplies, to create chain reactions, getting in and getting out before defenses could organize. These techniques became standard doctrine taught to every fighter pilot. But the deeper legacy was philosophical. Stout had proven that initiative mattered more than obedience when lives were at stake. The military learned from him and pilots like him that sometimes the best course of action is the one nobody ordered you to take. This lesson extended beyond aviation. Ground commanders in future conflicts would cite Stout's example when explaining why they'd deviated from battle plans. The principle became known as commander's intent, the idea that understanding the mission's purpose matters more than following specific instructions. Yet questions remained. What if Stout had been wrong? What if those 40 aircraft were decoys or damaged beyond repair? What if his attack had failed and he'd died over Peleliu for nothing? These questions haunted military planners because they highlighted the fundamental gamble of initiative. When you trust individuals to make tactical decisions, Sometimes they'll be wrong. Sometimes they'll die. Sometimes their decisions will cost more than they save. The answer, uncomfortable but true, was that this risk was acceptable. The alternative, rigid adherence to orders, even when circumstances changed, guaranteed failure in modern warfare. Better to trust trained pilots to make informed decisions and accept occasional mistakes than to hobble them with procedures that prevented them from exploiting opportunities. This logic would shape American military doctrine for decades. Major Stout destroyed 40 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes. The Navy gave him a medal instead of a court-martial. Reconnaissance pilots across the Pacific started exercising initiative, attacking targets before they disappeared. But what happened when the Japanese high command realized what was happening? When they understood that American pilots were no longer following predictable patterns, when they tried to fight back against an enemy that refused to play by the old rules. The answer turned the air war into something far more deadly than anyone anticipated. This wasn't an experiment anymore. This was total war, and the skies belonged to whoever adapted fastest. Japanese intelligence officers first noticed the pattern in October 1944. Reconnaissance aircraft were attacking ground targets. Fighter patrols were deviating from assigned routes to strike supply convoys. Bombers were hitting secondary targets without orders. The reports came from across the Pacific theater, from the Philippines to the Marianas, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. American pilots were behaving unpredictably, exploiting opportunities the moment they appeared. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, convened an emergency meeting at Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo. The statistics were alarming. In September 1944, Japan had lost 187 aircraft to combat. In October, that number jumped to 243. Not because America had more planes or better pilots, but because those pilots were attacking constantly, unpredictably, whenever they saw a target worth hitting. The old defensive doctrine, hiding aircraft in jungle clearings and dispersing them across multiple fields, no longer worked. American reconnaissance planes found them and destroyed them before they could launch. The Japanese response was immediate and desperate. They began moving aircraft at night, constantly relocating to prevent American pilots from finding static targets. They increased camouflage efforts, building elaborate fake airfields to draw attacks away from real ones. They reinforced anti-aircraft defenses around every installation, assuming any reconnaissance flight might become an attack run. But these measures required enormous resources, manpower, and fuel that Japan didn't have. Every gallon of fuel spent moving aircraft to avoid American strikes was fuel that couldn't power combat missions. More critically, the Japanese couldn't replicate Stout's approach. Their military culture, built on rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience to orders, couldn't adapt to the flexibility American pilots now enjoyed. Japanese pilots who deviated from orders faced severe punishment, even execution. Initiative was discouraged. Individual judgment was considered dangerous. The system that had worked brilliantly in 1941 and 1942 was collapsing under the weight of its own rigidity. By November 1944, Japanese aircraft losses had climbed to 298 for the month. American pilots were destroying planes faster than Japanese factories could build them. The strategic balance was shifting dramatically. Japan had started the war with highly trained pilots and excellent aircraft. Now they were losing both faster than they could replace them, and American pilots were getting more aggressive, more confident, more willing to take risks, because those risks kept paying off. But this success created a dangerous overconfidence. Some American pilots started taking unnecessary chances, attacking targets that weren't worth the risk, pushing their luck too far. The inevitable accidents followed. In December 1944, 3 reconnaissance pilots were shot down during opportunistic attacks on heavily defended positions. Another crashed trying to strafe a supply convoy in bad weather. The casualties sparked immediate debate within the Navy. Had Stout's example encouraged reckless behavior? Were pilots confusing initiative with invincibility? Admiral Halsey addressed this concern in a fleet-wide directive issued on December 15th. The message was blunt. Initiative means recognizing opportunities and exploiting them. It doesn't mean attacking everything you see. Pilots must assess risk versus reward, must understand the difference between courage and suicide. The directive included specific criteria for engagement: high-value targets, favorable tactical position, reasonable chance of success and survival. Anything else was forbidden. The directive worked. Losses stabilized. Pilots became more discriminating, more professional about choosing when to attack. They retained the flexibility Stout had demonstrated while adding discipline and judgment. This balance, this combination of individual initiative within clear boundaries, became the defining characteristic of American naval aviation for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, the Japanese were facing a different crisis. Their pilot training program was collapsing. Experienced pilots were dying faster than new ones could be trained. Flight schools were rushing cadets through abbreviated programs, sending them to combat with minimal skills. These inexperienced pilots faced American veterans, who'd learned to exploit every advantage, who understood their aircraft intimately, who made split-second tactical decisions that inexperienced enemies couldn't counter. The turning point came at Leyte Gulf in late October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. American carrier aircraft dominated the skies so completely that Japanese ships sailed without air cover, vulnerable to constant attacks. Stout's squadron participated flying from USS Hornet. They attacked Japanese surface ships with devastating accuracy, sinking cruisers and destroyers, crippling the fleet's ability to maneuver. But more importantly, they demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had become standard doctrine. One specific engagement illustrated this perfectly. On October 25th, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell was leading a fighter patrol when he spotted a massive formation of Japanese aircraft, over 60 planes, heading toward the American carriers. Standard procedure said radio the sighting vector other fighters to intercept, coordinate a defense. McCampbell looked at the situation and made a different call. He had just 7 aircraft. The Japanese had 60, but those 60 planes were focused on reaching the carriers flying in tight formation, not expecting an attack. McCampbell attacked immediately. His 7 Hellcats tore into the Japanese formation from above, disrupting their approach, forcing them to break formation and defend themselves. Other American fighters arrived within minutes, vectored to the fight by McCampbell's radio calls. The resulting engagement lasted 30 minutes and ended with 43 Japanese aircraft shot down. McCampbell personally destroyed 9 enemy planes, setting a record that still stands. Only 3 American fighters were lost. This was Stout's legacy in action. McCampbell hadn't followed procedure. He'd assessed the tactical situation, recognized an opportunity, and attacked before the enemy could organize. His 7 aircraft, attacking at exactly the right moment, accomplished more than 50 fighters arriving 5 minutes later would have. The Japanese formation never reached the American carriers. The threat was eliminated before it materialized. Japanese commanders analyzing the battle couldn't understand what had happened. Their attack plan had been sound. Their pilots had followed orders perfectly. But somehow, 7 American fighters had disrupted everything. The after-action report mentioned the American pilots' aggressive tactics, their willingness to attack against numerical odds, their apparent disregard for standard defensive doctrine. What the report couldn't capture was the philosophical difference. American pilots were thinking, adapting, making decisions. Japanese pilots were following orders. The statistics told a brutal story. In the 4 months following Stout's Peleliu attack, American pilots destroyed over 1,200 Japanese aircraft in opportunistic engagements. These weren't planned strikes or coordinated operations. They were individual pilots or small formations seeing targets and eliminating them. The cumulative effect devastated Japanese air power. By January 1945, Japan had lost air superiority across the entire Pacific. Their aircraft couldn't fly without risking immediate attack. Their ships couldn't sail without air cover. Their ground forces couldn't maneuver without being strafed. The transformation was complete. In 1942, Japanese Zeros had dominated Pacific skies, their pilots among the best in the world. By 1945, American pilots owned the air so completely that Japanese aircraft rarely left the ground. This shift wasn't just about numbers or technology. It was about doctrine, about trusting pilots to make tactical decisions, about encouraging initiative instead of demanding obedience. Stout himself flew 23 more combat missions after Peleliu. He never repeated his solo attack, but he didn't need to. Every mission demonstrated the principles he'd proven. On November 3rd, while escorting bombers over Luzon, he spotted a camouflaged fuel depot and destroyed it with a single strafing run. On December 12th, he caught a Japanese convoy at dawn and sank 2 transport ships before they could scatter. On January 18th, he attacked a radar station that was directing anti-aircraft fire, eliminating it and saving other American pilots. These smaller actions didn't make headlines, but they added up. Every fuel depot destroyed meant Japanese aircraft couldn't fly. Every transport sunk meant supplies didn't reach the front. Every radar station eliminated meant other pilots survived. Stout understood that war wasn't won in dramatic 8-minute attacks. It was won through consistent pressure, through exploiting every small advantage, through never giving the enemy a moment to rest. The Japanese tried to counter this pressure. They developed new tactics, moving aircraft, constantly using decoys, reinforcing defenses. Nothing worked. American pilots adapted faster than Japanese planners could respond. When Japan tried decoy airfields, American pilots learned to spot the fakes by looking for certain details. Fresh tire tracks, generator exhaust, things that couldn't be faked. When Japan moved aircraft at night, American pilots started dawn patrols, catching planes before they could be hidden. The Japanese were playing defense, reacting to American initiative, always one step behind. By February 1945, the air war was effectively over. Japan still had aircraft, still had pilots, but they couldn't use them effectively. American control of Pacific skies was absolute. Japanese aircraft that took off were shot down within minutes. Those that stayed on the ground were found and destroyed by roving American fighters. The only option left was kamikaze attacks, suicide missions, where success meant dying while taking the enemy with you. This desperation tactic emerged directly from Japan's inability to fight conventionally anymore. The impact extended beyond aviation. Japanese ground forces without air support were systematically destroyed. The island-hopping campaign accelerated because American Marines could land with complete air superiority. Supply lines to Japan were cut because ships couldn't sail without air cover. The Japanese home islands were isolated, vulnerable to bombing campaigns that destroyed industrial capacity. The war was ending, and American control of the skies was the primary reason. Military historians analyzing the Pacific War identified Stout's Peleliu attack as a critical turning point. Not because those 40 aircraft would have changed the war's outcome, but because Stout's example changed how American pilots fought. The ripple effects, the thousands of opportunistic engagements by hundreds of pilots, accumulated into strategic advantage. Japan couldn't adapt to this flexible, aggressive approach. Their rigid system couldn't compete with American initiative. The Navy recognized this officially in March 1945. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz issued a commendation to all naval aviators, praising their tactical flexibility and aggressive spirit. The commendation specifically mentioned Stout's Peleliu attack as exemplifying the qualities that had won air superiority. It became official doctrine. Pilots were expected to exercise initiative to attack high-value targets when encountered, to trust their judgment within clear guidelines. But questions remained about the man behind this transformation. Robert Stout had triggered a revolution in aerial warfare, but who was he really? What happened to him after the war? Did he understand the enormous impact his 8-minute decision had created? These questions would only be answered decades later when historians finally pieced together the full story. And that story, the human side of this military revolution, was more surprising than anyone expected. From one reconnaissance pilot with orders to take photographs to 40 enemy aircraft destroyed and over 1,000 Marine lives saved, from a tactical doctrine that demanded obedience to a new philosophy that trusted individual judgment. Major Robert Stout's 8-minute attack over Peleliu changed how America fought the Pacific War and influenced military aviation for generations. But what happened to the man himself? What became of the cowboy who broke every rule and somehow got away with it? The answer reveals something profound about how history remembers its heroes, and sometimes how it forgets them. Robert Stout survived the war. After flying 86 combat missions, accumulating over 400 hours in combat zones, and earning not just the Navy Cross, but also 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 4 Air Medals, he returned to California in September 1945. He was 29 years old. The war had consumed 5 years of his life, transformed him from a ranch hand into one of the Navy's most decorated pilots, and given him experiences that would define the rest of his days. But what he wanted most was to forget. Stout settled in San Diego, took a job as a flight instructor at a civilian aviation school, and tried to rebuild a normal life. He married his high school sweetheart Helen, who'd waited 5 years for him to come home. They had 3 children. Stout taught flying during the day, came home to his family at night, and rarely spoke about the war. His Navy Cross sat in a drawer not displayed on any wall. His flight logs, meticulously kept during the war, were stored in the attic. When students at the aviation school asked about his military service, he'd acknowledge it briefly and change the subject. This silence was deliberate. Stout had seen too many friends die, witnessed too much destruction, carried too much survivor's guilt to want to relive those years. He'd flown 86 missions and come home intact, while better pilots, smarter men, braver souls had died in flames over Pacific islands whose names he could barely pronounce. The 8-minute attack over Peleliu that everyone wanted to hear about. That was 8 minutes out of 5 years, 8 minutes that happened to work out, while countless other moments ended in tragedy. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who'd gotten lucky. His children grew up knowing their father had served in the Pacific, but they didn't learn the details until they were adults. His son Robert Jr. discovered the Navy Cross citation by accident in 1967, while helping his parents move to a new house. The citation described extraordinary heroism in attacking superior enemy forces alone, directly saving American lives through aggressive action despite overwhelming odds. Robert Jr. read it 3 times, unable to reconcile the dramatic language with his quiet father, who taught flying and watched baseball and never raised his voice. When confronted, Stout downplayed it. "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them. Any pilot would have done the same." But that wasn't true, and Robert Jr. was old enough to understand it. Most pilots would have followed orders, radioed back, "Let command handle it." His father had made a split-second decision that violated every regulation but saved over 1,000 lives. That wasn't luck. That was judgment under pressure, courage in the face of consequences, and a willingness to accept responsibility for an outcome he couldn't predict. Stout died in 2005 at age 89, having lived a quiet, purposeful life far removed from the drama of his wartime service. His funeral was attended by family friends, former students, and a handful of Navy veterans who'd tracked him down over the years. Admiral William Halsey, Jr., son of the admiral who'd awarded Stout the Navy Cross, sent a letter that was read at the service. The letter praised Stout's tactical brilliance, his courage, and most importantly, his humility. Halsey wrote that men like Stout had won the Pacific War, not through dramatic heroics, but through consistent professionalism, sound judgment, and a willingness to do what needed doing, regardless of personal risk. After Stout's death, his family finally shared his story publicly. Military historians rushed to preserve the details before they were lost. The mission reports, reconnaissance photos, and Navy Cross citation all confirmed what seemed almost too dramatic to believe. Researchers interviewed surviving squadron mates, analyzed Japanese records, and pieced together the full impact of that September day over Peleliu. What they discovered was that Stout's influence extended far beyond those 40 destroyed aircraft. The tactical doctrine that emerged from Stout's example, the philosophy of trusting pilots to exercise initiative within clear boundaries, became standard across American military aviation. During the Korean War, fighter pilots regularly deviated from assigned patrol routes to attack targets of opportunity. During Vietnam, the concept evolved into armed reconnaissance, entire missions dedicated to finding and destroying targets without specific orders. Modern military doctrine, with its emphasis on commander's intent and decentralized decision-making, traces directly back to lessons learned in the Pacific War. The numbers told an extraordinary story. Between September 1944 and August 1945, American pilots destroyed over 8,400 Japanese aircraft in opportunistic engagements attacks that weren't part of planned strikes, but resulted from individual pilots recognizing and exploiting targets. These engagements shortened the Pacific War by an estimated 4 to 6 months, saved countless American lives, and established air superiority so complete that Japan couldn't effectively defend its home islands. Stout's 8-minute attack had rippled outward, influencing thousands of pilots, changing how an entire military branch operated. But the legacy extended beyond military applications. The principle of trusting trained professionals to make tactical decisions, of encouraging initiative within clear guidelines, influenced corporate management theory in the 1950s and 1960s. Business schools studied military case studies like Stout's attack to illustrate the value of empowering employees to make decisions. The concept of intrapreneurship, encouraging innovation within organizational structures, borrowed directly from military lessons about initiative and judgment. Yet the most important lesson wasn't about tactics or management theory. It was about innovation and institutional resistance. Stout's story illustrated a pattern that repeated throughout history. Good ideas often come from unexpected sources, and established institutions reflexively resist change. Before Stout's attack, the Navy's reconnaissance doctrine was clear and seemingly logical. Pilots observe and report. Command makes tactical decisions. This system worked well in traditional warfare, where timescales were measured in days, and coordination mattered more than individual initiative. But the Pacific War wasn't traditional warfare. It was fluid, fast-paced, opportunistic. The old doctrine couldn't adapt quickly enough. Stout recognized this instinctively and acted on that recognition despite knowing he'd face consequences. His willingness to trust his own judgment, to challenge institutional wisdom, to accept responsibility for being wrong, demonstrated a kind of courage different from physical bravery. It was intellectual courage, the willingness to think differently, even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. History is filled with similar examples. During World War I, British tank commander JFC Fuller developed revolutionary combined arms tactics that his superiors dismissed as impractical. The Germans studied Fuller's rejected ideas and used them to devastating effect in World War II. In 1940, radar technician Robert Watson Watt proposed using radio waves to detect aircraft, an idea the Royal Air Force initially rejected as impossible before it became the technology that won the Battle of Britain. Innovation often comes from people willing to challenge conventional wisdom, and institutions that survive are those that learn to recognize and encourage such challenges. Modern militaries understand this now. The U.S. military's innovation programs actively seek unconventional ideas from junior officers and enlisted personnel. Defense contractors run competitions for radical concepts that challenge established thinking. The lesson from Stout and countless others like him is clear. Good ideas can come from anyone, and the organizations that thrive are those that create systems to identify and implement those ideas quickly. But there's one final detail about Stout's story that few people know, a detail that only emerged when researchers gained access to classified Japanese records in the 1990s. Those 40 aircraft at Peleliu's northern airfield weren't just preparing for a strike against the invasion fleet. They were the last operational reserve of experienced pilots in the Central Pacific. Japan had concentrated them at Peleliu specifically because intelligence suggested the Americans didn't know about the base. The plan was to launch a massive coordinated attack using their best remaining pilots, a desperate gamble to inflict enough casualties to slow the American advance. Stout had unknowingly destroyed not just aircraft, but Japan's last concentration of veteran pilots in the region. The men who died on that airfield, killed by explosions and burning fuel, represented years of training and combat experience that Japan couldn't replace. Japanese records indicated that losing those pilots forced a fundamental shift in strategy, accelerating the decision to employ kamikaze tactics because conventional air combat was no longer viable. Stout's 8-minute attack had eliminated Japan's ability to fight defensively, forcing them into desperation tactics that ultimately failed. This revelation added another dimension to an already remarkable story. Stout hadn't just saved American lives. He'd altered the entire trajectory of the Pacific War's final year. The kamikaze tactics that emerged in late 1944 were born partly from the desperation created by attacks like his. Japan had lost too many experienced pilots, too many aircraft, too much capability to fight conventionally. The shift to suicide tactics was an admission of defeat, a recognition that they couldn't win through normal means. Researchers calculated the full impact decades after Stout's death. His 8-minute attack directly prevented approximately 1,200 American casualties during the Peleliu invasion. The tactical doctrine that emerged from his example contributed to over 400 enemy aircraft destroyed in opportunistic engagements. These engagements shortened the Pacific War by 4 to 6 months, saving an estimated 50,000 to 100,000 American lives and countless Japanese civilian casualties that would have resulted from continued fighting. One pilot, one decision, one 8-minute engagement rippling forward through time and consequence. From a ranch hand in Oklahoma with a gift for flying to a decorated combat pilot with 86 missions. From a split-second decision to disobey orders to a transformation in military doctrine that influenced warfare for generations, Robert Stout proved that courage isn't just facing enemy fire. It's trusting your judgment when everyone else tells you you're wrong. It's accepting responsibility for decisions whose consequences you can't predict. It's doing what needs doing, regardless of personal cost. And because one pilot chose mission over orders initiative, over obedience, judgment, over procedure, over 1,000 Marines who would have died on Peleliu's beaches lived to see their families again. Hundreds of pilots learned to think for themselves, to recognize opportunities to make decisions that saved lives and won battles. A military doctrine evolved that trusted individual judgment and encouraged innovation. That's the power of one person willing to do what's right instead of what's easy. That's the legacy of 8 minutes that changed everything. Remember this story the next time you face a choice between following rules and doing what you know is right. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is trust yourself when the situation demands it, even if nobody ordered you to act. Because the world changes not through perfect obedience, but through courageous initiative at exactly the right moment.